Hi, I'm Professor Wallace. I'm chairman of the Institute, and I want to welcome you. This program is going to be moderated by Yona Alexander and by Ambassador Ray. This is really part of a series that Yona is sort of building up on diplomacy, and I think you'll enjoy it a great deal. One word to the panel about these microphones. Those microphones do not amplify your voice. They just pick up your voice for recording. So if you feel you're not speaking loudly enough where you're sitting, then please come up here, because one of these is supposed to be amplifying us. Yona?
Yeah. All the participants, as Professor Wallace indicated, should come up here initially and then sit down and relax, and during the discussion they don't have to come back here. So basically, I think what I wanted to begin and mention that two weeks ago we had right here an event, also Ambassadors Forum, the current state of American diplomacy and future outlook. And basically, the focus was what is the outlook for American diplomacy, and will the diplomats have the support and resources they need to effectively implement American policy. So this was the rationale for the meeting, and we were fortunate to have, at the time, of course, Professor Don Wallace and Ambassador Newman and Ambassador Charles Ray and General Algray who participated. And what we're going to do today, I'm going to ask our colleague, Charlie Ray, who is going to support our efforts today to conduct the discussion, to introduce briefly the members of the panel.
Thank you, Dr. Alexander. It's a real honor to be here with such an august group of people. As General Gray said when he came in, there's so many ambassadors here, one has to wonder who's running the country. Sorry, General, I had to steal that. It was too good. We have an ambitious topic from the subject title, as you can see, but if you read the introduction on your program, I think you'll see why it's also very appropriate. And the people we have speaking today, I think, are very appropriate spokespersons for these global issues that we, the world, will face in the coming decades. First of all, my good friend and colleague, retired Ambassador Ron Newman, who's the president of the American Academy of Diplomacy and who has extensive service in the Middle East. Ambassador Lino Guterres, who served as ambassador to Argentina and Nicaragua, and is currently the executive director of the Cox Foundation, which supports strengthening diplomatic capacity in the United States. And Ambassador Rosemary Banks, the New Zealand ambassador to the U.S., who has more experience than we have time here for me to reiterate. But she's worked at the UN, and so she's very knowledgeable of the international dimension and the multilateral dimension of diplomacy. And finally, I'd like to welcome Dr. Mir Sadat, Director of Defense Policy and Strategy at the U.S. National Security Council, Navy veteran, I believe. Navy veteran, extensive work in the Navy. He worked in space strategy, and I think given that our world is becoming increasingly digital and that space could one day be the next battleground, I think he's a very appropriate speaker. So first, Ambassador Newman, if you would honor us with your presentation.
You're not going to make a presentation?
Me? I just did.
I meant a substantive one, Charles.
Your own extensive.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Yona. Thank you for having me. Yes, we do have rather a lot of ambassadors. It reminds me that when I first joined the Foreign Service to make me understand the true importance of diplomacy, a colleague sent me a page that he had torn out of a magazine, and it was an ad for a White Owl cigar called Diplomats, and it said, "Diplomats, 2 for $1 at your cigar store." That has kept me a certain balance since then. Well, when I was asked to do this, and I got around to looking at the program, and it talked particularly about reflections based on our experience, which maybe was taken as a caveat not to pontificate too much about things we haven't actually experienced. So in any event, I'm going to follow those guidance, those instructions. And so I'm not particularly looking at a whole range of other international issues, from disease to cybercrime to things that other people are working on, and I'm sort of staying in the lane of my own experience. My own experience is somewhat unusually tilted, I think, to conflict, having served in Algeria and during a very bloody period, and Iraq, and Afghanistan, not to mention Yemen in a more peaceful period, but when we still had threats of assassination, and Bahrain when we had mobs storming the embassy occasionally. So it's maybe not quite the traditional experience. I would note one, maybe 2 caveats. One is that I think statecraft diplomacy has long been adding to its kit bag a lot besides traditional statecraft. That's hardly a new change. But I would also note, lest people get too carried away with what's new, that we still have almost all the old responsibilities. And we've turned in our electric quill sharpeners, but it's very difficult beyond that to think of what it is or was that a 19th century diplomat was responsible for which a 21st century diplomat is not also responsible. Now, there is a great deal which 21st century diplomats are responsible for in addition to those 19th century duties, but lest one get too caught up in focusing on the new, it's useful to remember how much of the old still has to be done as well. So going to, sort of my own experience, and remembering that there's always a danger in lessons learned that the diplomats, politicians, as much as the generals, may fight the last war. And you can not always trust the last lesson to be the right lesson. But nonetheless, since mine is, I've watched a lot of interventions over my period in diplomacy, starting from experiencing one in the infantry in Vietnam, I would say my first lesson is that we are not done with war, and we are not done with interventions. And it is the mood of the country right now not to want to do these sorts of things. And there is a tendency to say never again, which means that for many, the answer to how do we prepare to do things better is no, we won't do it. This is a profoundly ahistorical view. Every administration since Truman's has had foreign interventions. There's not a single one since World War II that American administrations which has not had a foreign intervention. So the idea that we're going to avoid it, much as desirable as that might be, is, I think, misplaced. Or at least it demands that history stop. So what are the lessons for diplomacy, assuming you take that as a starting point? Well, one is that you can make war without diplomats, but you can't make the peace. We've just, we've tried that in Iraq, which is a particular example. But let me give you 2 other examples and then just talk about them a little bit. We need allies even in war, which is a primary diplomatic task. And you can threaten war, but it's a lot cheaper not to fight, which means diplomacy, again, is the essential tool of war prevention. Now, Iraq is in many ways sort of a poster child for how to mess up by taking a war without taking diplomacy. There was no provision for the aftermath. The planning done in the State Department of varying quality was simply brushed aside and not utilized. And in fact, intellectually, it wasn't really in the military lexicon. I wish I had $1 for every military briefing slide I've seen that has 4 phases from the preparatory 0 phase and goes up through phase 3, which is war, and then phase 4 is afterwards. And that was never detailed. In those days, diplomats would solve it. That has changed enormously. I don't know any current senior officers who really have that view anymore. They've quite gotten beyond it. But I don't know that our politicians have gotten beyond it. And that's not only a dig at this administration, because, one feature of American politics is that in the 70 odd years from World War II, we have only elected 3 presidents who came to office with any real knowledge of foreign affairs before they arrived in the presidency. That was Eisenhower, Nixon, and the first Bush. No other president actually had any real experience with foreign policy before they came to office. So we're not sure what will be known. So there was very little diplomacy in the run-up to the Iraq War. And one of the things you see is that a war of the willing can lose support much faster than a war of allies. And all that tells you that diplomacy remains critical. Now, interestingly enough, when ISIS, Islamic State, broke out the insurgency in Iraq, we needed a lot of diplomacy to support the fighting. The news reports were all about sending troops and fighting the Islamic State. One of the things we do in my day job, the American Academy of Diplomacy, are a number of podcasts. One series is called The General and the Ambassador. There are actually 3 different ones that deal with different phases of the Iraq War. And for people who want to get deeply into how diplomacy and military work together, there's one of General Petraeus with Ambassador Crocker. There's another one of Ambassador Jeffrey with General Lloyd Austin, who was CENTCOM commander at the time. I think sometimes that one could have been retitled to How Together We Fought Washington and ISIS, but there's a lot about policy in it. And there's one that just went up reasonably, fairly few weeks ago with Ambassador Stu Jones and General McFarland. And that goes through an enormous number of political issues, including how they work together, how they could talk to certain besieged units. Other units were off limits because of their terrorist affiliations, and how the diplomacy had to maneuver with the prime minister to make possible certain military arrangements. So while there's I think, misconception in many Americans that you just send troops and they go fight, in fact, that kind of fighting is enormously political, and there's an enormous role for diplomacy in it. And I think this is one of the things one can carry away. One can look at 2 other experiences, and I won't go into detail because I think these things are pretty well known, but 2 contrasting wars and experiences, the first Gulf War and Afghanistan. In the first Gulf War, you had an enormous amount of diplomacy in order to bring together a coalition. It was also the last war America fought at a profit, because we got a lot of allies to contribute. We actually had a surplus left over at the end of the war. But the coalition that put together NATO troops from NATO countries, allied troops, Syrian troops, and Egyptian troops side by side with American troops to launch the liberation of Iraq is a stupendous feat of diplomacy, and one that we have not equaled since. But it shows the difference in organizing. And then in Afghanistan, I think one of the things that's so interesting is that when we finally decided we needed allies in Afghanistan, which was not at the beginning, and NATO really joined us, and NATO has stayed vested in Afghanistan. We are 18 years in, and we have not had nearly as much donor fatigue as one might have expected to have by this point in the war. And it's very interesting that in the lead up to the Trump administration's major decision last year about staying in Afghanistan, you had countries like Germany and Italy pushing us to remain involved in Afghanistan because they understood the importance of it and they were prepared to keep their own troops there, but they couldn't do it without us being there as well. So when you have real alliances and real friends, you have more support. And all those are requirements of diplomacy, which I believe will continue to be requirements of diplomacy as we go forward in the world. There are a lot of other kinds of interventions that I haven't been so much involved with, UN peacekeeping kinds of things. I'll leave that for others to reflect on. So what would I say at the end? The conflicts of the kind I've experienced don't have easy answers. We're still in Afghanistan. What I would say is that diplomacy cannot substitute for a good policy, but diplomacy can make a bad policy work much better. A bad policy without diplomacy will be doubly bad. And to come back to the enduring question of what the future looks like, based on my experience, there will be absolutely no shortage of the need for diplomacy. Employment is guaranteed. There really are no lanes. There is no military and diplomatic in much of the world which is separate. They constantly affect each other, and you can't intelligently or responsibly use one tool without the other. Remember, General Zinni once said, because people talk about, well, do you need diplomacy more? Do you need force more? He said, my uncle Guido was a plumber, and if you'd asked him if you need a pliers or a screwdriver more, he'd have thought you were crazy. And that stuck in my mind as a pretty good basic example of the proper answer to that question. So there are no lanes. They must be bound together. And since we're going to need diplomacy, since this subject is not well understood, and since there are no lanes, I would submit that there is a huge need to educate the public. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Newman gave you the 30,000-foot view, and I'll try to give you a more personal one. From my experiences as 29 years in the State Department, service in 7 different countries, working for 6 presidents, 11 or 13 secretaries of state, depending on whom you count, and a secretary of commerce. In 1992, businessman Ross Perot said that embassies had gone the way of the sailing ship. And if he were elected president, he would move to abolish all embassies. Somebody asked him, well, how would you communicate with world leaders? He said, oh, they got this new thing called email that we can do. Thankfully for us career diplomats, he was not elected. And I had a job for the next 15 years or so before I retired. And in my experiences, the State Department provides something nobody else can, and that is knowledge of countries. During the Clinton administration, we had a secretary named Warren Christopher who wanted to redo the State Department. This was one of many efforts. There was another recent one under this administration. And we did a deep dive into what do we do that's better. And the answer was knowledge of countries. Nobody else can tell you that if you go to a meeting in Buenos Aires and your interlocutor is 30 minutes late, it's not that he's disrespecting you. It's called hora latina, and you should not take offense. Or how to deal in the Middle East. Or that you can't come in like a bull in a china shop as a U.S. businessman and say, okay, what's the bottom line here? No, how are your children? How about them Yankees? I'm not a Yankee fan, but that hurts to say it. Dodgers. So it's a knowledge of what will work. And we have a reputation around Washington of being the naysayer sometimes. Because every State Department line at an interagency meeting begins with, if you do that, this will happen. Or you can't do that because. And then people in the NSC or the military might get mad and say, they're not with the program. They're not with the president. But that's what we know. That's what we get paid to do. And that's what we, I think, can provide a vital role in avoiding U.S. embarrassment, etc. Actually, I was going to steal a second pen, but I think, Ron, you left yours. So let me give you just a few instances in my career. When I was a junior officer in the Dominican Republic, which is a country in which we intervened in 1965, they were having a critical election. And the pro-US president had been reelected 3 times, and everybody assumed he would be reelected again. So they sent me to the countryside. Now, I had no problem blending into the Dominican Republic because I was born in Cuba. So the culture was very similar to me. The language was perfectly understood. And I did a tour of the eastern part of the island, talking to mayors, political leaders, businessmen, etc. And I wrote a report saying, I think the opposition is going to emerge triumphant in the next election in this part of the country. Well, the deputy chief of mission, who was a 30-year veteran, I think tossed my report in the trash can, saying this is a first tour officer, what does he know, etc. Well, lo and behold, the opposition did win the election, and then people started saying, who was that guy who wrote that report again? By the way, since then I learned never to predict anything if you're a diplomat, because nobody will remember if you're right, and everybody will blame you if you're wrong. So by a diplomat going out in the countryside, talking to people, and writing a report, you prepare people in intelligence and research and others of how to prepare for the next government. And I think that's value added for the State Department. When I was in Haiti, and this is where the international politics intersects with the domestic politics, we had what we called a boat crisis in Haiti, in that Haitians started taking to the seas in record numbers and landing on Florida shores. Well, naturally, Florida authorities were yelling at Washington saying, well, why can't you stop this? And this, of course, unleashed a number of other players like human rights activists saying, we need to take these people. They're coming from a dictatorship and from an oppressed, they are oppressed by the dictator. And, local officials saying, send them back, or we can't take them in. And that put the Reagan administration in a deep quandary. We were able, by negotiating with the Haitian government, the Haitian government had no interest in stopping the boat people. Haiti was the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, so there were less mouths to feed. And this dictatorship, we were able to negotiate with them an agreement that U.S. diplomats would help welcome the returning Haitians, which the Coast Guard by that time had 17 ships off the Haitian coast ready to intersect the migrants at sea. So we worked out a diplomatic agreement that we would interview the Haitian migrants that we intercepted at sea, find out if any had valid claims for political asylum, and bring the other ones back. But to satisfy human rights advocates, we would send embassy officers into the Haitian countryside to interview them to make sure they were not persecuted. So without a diplomatic corps that was willing to look at all these aspects, to negotiate with this government of Jean-Claude Duvalier, self-titled Président à vie, President for life, we were able to get to a win-win situation where we could satisfy human rights activists, the Florida authorities, the Haitian government, etc. And this is something that you cannot do by gunboat diplomacy alone. You need people who know the country, who know what can be accomplished, and to get to a win-win for both countries. I was also deployed to Grenada in 1983 after the U.S. 82nd Airborne and the Marines came in to save over 1,000 U.S. medical students. And I was given the task of negotiating with the Cuban diplomats who were still on the island and to help negotiate the return of the few hundred Cuban construction workers / military reservists who were hiding out in the Russian embassy and other places. And my having been born in Cuba, my knowledge of the language, etc., allowed me to deliver a very clear message and let the Cuban authorities there know exactly what we would allow and not allow, because it's easy to do diplomacy with the 82nd Airborne behind you, I gotta tell you. I used to walk into the Cuban embassy and there was a ring of 82nd Airborne behind. But we worked out a compromise where the Cuban diplomats would agree to leave and they had to be searched, but they wanted to make a few statements, so we had to do a little bit of guerrilla theater, if you will, in that we would bring in trucks. They would make a speech saying, "No, we will not be searched by these imperialists," fine. And then the trucks would return the next day and take them all away and search them. So the knowledge of how to deal with what the other party expects, I think, is something that a diplomat who knows the country, knows the language, and has experience can do. A couple of more instances. In Nicaragua, we had Hurricane Mitch, which was the worst disaster in Central American history. It was a hurricane that stopped. You know, hurricanes usually come through, like Hurricane Andrew came through and wreaked havoc in the Bahamas and South Florida, etc. Hurricane Mitch stayed on top of Central America, and there was more rain in that period than in a short time than ever in history, and it washed away all the infrastructure and, you know, killed thousands of people. Well, I was ambassador to Nicaragua at the time, to persuade General Wilhelm to request an army construction team that would come in with troops and rebuild schools, roads, and bridges. But the opposition in Nicaragua was very anti-American, led by the current president, Daniel Ortega. And they mounted a propaganda campaign that said, these troops, first of all, they are Marines who invaded Nicaragua back in the days of Chesty Puller in the early 20th century, and they're coming back. They're bringing AIDS to the population. So we're going to have a massive outbreak of AIDS. And they're going to map out targets so they can bomb us later. And this was the time we were bombing in the Balkans with the Apache helicopters and everything. How can you counter that? Well, there's something called public diplomacy that we did. How do we do that? Well, I negotiated with the military that when they landed in Nicaragua, they would not come in with their weapons, as is often the case, but the weapons would come in crated and brought into the country that way. That the Nicaraguan army agreed to provide perimeter security for the U.S. troops, which took quite a bit of negotiation. That U.S. helicopters and Nicaraguan helicopters would work side by side in delivering relief supplies. And this one hurt a lot to our troops, but no liquor would be allowed during any, in the country, and they would not be allowed to go to bars, etc. Well, and when the troops arrived, we unleashed the Nicaraguan press on the arriving soldiers and Marines, and they found there were people just like them. They had this image of 6'3" blonde Americans who spoke no Spanish. Well, you had Latinos, you had African Americans, Arab Americans, whites who spoke Spanish, everybody. And they were asked, are you here to invade? Are you here to bring AIDS? No, I'm here to help. End of story. Daniel Ortega had to retreat, and the troops were universally welcomed. This is public diplomacy. This is something that only, I believe, diplomats with experience and speaking the language can. So we live in a messy world today. When Ron Newman and I came into the Foreign Service, Charlie Ray was still in the military, and then he came a few years later, the world was very black and white. You know who the enemy was. Who has the missiles pointed at Des Moines? It wasn't the French. It wasn't the Germans. It wasn't the, Iranians at that time. It was the Russians. It was the Soviets. It was a bipolar world. And often the world is viewed in zero-sum terms, which I think probably we took it a little too far. But after the fall of the wall, after Francis Fukuyama wrote The End of History, as he saw it, the world changed. And it was the end of one history, but the beginning of another history. And this could be called a messier world. A world where there are not just two superpowers, but one major superpower. Now maybe China's creeping up, and we can talk about bipolarity again. And a lot of independent actors. A world with less control, where nuclear weapons could be lost if not accounted for. A world where issues like climate change, and we had diplomats had to be involved in human trafficking, cyber warfare, space warfare, etc. Today's diplomat has to know a lot more than we did when we came in to deal with all the threats that come to the United States. In fact, I had to become an insect expert a couple of times in my career. One time in the Azores, where we had a military base, and in the Azores, the farmers were noticing that Japanese beetles were all over the country. And of course, whom to blame but the US military, whose flights came from places where there was Japanese beetle. So we had to negotiate an agreement with the Portuguese to see if we could get rid of the Japanese beetles. And I had to learn about not only eradication by spraying and all that, but the program that we finally agreed on was a milky spore program, whereby we would bring in flies or insects that would mate with the Japanese beetles, but they would be sterile, and there would be no more Japanese beetles in the Azores. And we agreed to pay for most of that, which is a lot cheaper than spraying. So these are the kinds of issues that we have to deal with today. And we have to do a better job of explaining to the American public what we do. When most of us go back home, sometimes we get asked, you work for the State Department of what? The state of Alabama or the state of Georgia or what? You say you're in the Forest Service. We have to explain what we do, because many Americans, some say 46%, don't give a damn about diplomacy and why it's important. And when a preemptive cut is announced of a 30% cut to the Department of State, many people say, well, these people are just, wearing, striped pants and drinking tea with a little finger out and all that. Well, show them images of our embassies in Dar es Salaam and in Nairobi when they were bombed, and show those diplomats underneath the rubble trying to save their local employees from death, or show them in the jungle, looking for lost American citizens. And more Foreign Service officers have died in service than generals in combat. And these are kinds of things that I think the American public needs to know. And we need to do a better job of telling them. So we have to do a better job of explaining. We have to be more adaptable. We have to be ready for anything. And I think we can do it. But we need your support and the public support. Thank you.
Professor Wallace, Professor Alexander, Ambassadors General, Our question today is, what kind of diplomacy do we need for the future? Since the essential purpose, as has been said by previous speakers about diplomacy, is to prevent war and to reduce the risks of war, let's have a look first at the nature of risks that we face today. The World Economic Forum's 2019 Global Risk Analysis, which I think is always worth studying, identified this year rising geopolitical and geoeconomic threats, followed by environmental risk, and thirdly, in their order of priority, technological vulnerabilities, from fake news to loss of privacy. The report notes that global risks are intensifying, but the collective will to tackle them appears to be lacking. It saw the world as moving into a phase of state-centered politics, where the idea of taking back control behind national borders is gaining support in many countries. A symptom of that inward turning trend is the retreat that we're seeing from multilateralism, the sort of loss of confidence in the global architecture that together we've created over the last 70 years. These trends identified run contrary to the purpose of traditional diplomacy, which has been to draw nations into closer understanding of each other, to keep the channels of dialogue open when there's a risk of conflict, and to create and keep in order an architecture of regional and international rules and norms. There's a strong temptation on occasions like today to sink into an analysis of known problems rather than trying to work out what to do about them. So I'm going to try and be like a good student and stick to the exam question: what's the diplomacy of the future? But before I do set down that path, within the spirit of Maori culture in New Zealand, I'll share with you a little bit of what they call whakapapa, where I've come from, the life experience that I bring in speaking to you today. So my diplomatic career began more than 40 years ago, and yes, I was only aged 10 when I joined our Foreign Service. I grew up in the country. I attended Canterbury University. I studied Russian, actually, because in those days it was considered really important to understand what the Russians were doing and thinking, as has been alluded to by a previous speaker. My previous postings were most recently, I was ambassador in Paris. Before that, I was permanent representative to the United Nations in New York. And I've also served as deputy chief of mission in Canberra, in the Solomon Islands, and before that at the UN in Geneva. My views of diplomacy are obviously shaped by having been a diplomat for a small country that is actually only 4.7 million people, which sounds frighteningly tiny in this context of the United States. We've always, in other words, had to win our place on a crowded global stage. We're an open society. Despite our geographical isolation throughout history, we have been ready to contribute to global peace. Our diplomacy has rested on our reputation as a reliable country, on the leverage that we've gained from our integration into those global and regional architectures, and also on our network of connections. Our diplomatic successes have come from our ability to be a bridge between cultures, regions, and sometimes even between major partners, major powers. Our diplomatic brand, if I think every country has one in a way, has been to be independent in our analysis, solution-focused, and good at interpersonal relations. These capabilities of independent analysis, being solution-focused and able to create trust through good interpersonal relations, are timeless, and previous speakers have mentioned the timelessness of most diplomatic qualities. They're also universal, as I see it, across countries and across cultures. They're necessary, but not sufficient in themselves to bridge some of the most dangerous gaps in today's world. Growing mistrust that we see, both within and between nations, the existential threat of climate change, and perhaps worst of all, a lack of global consensus on what kind of rules and approaches we need to deal with these problems. What has already changed in my diplomatic career has been the breadth of issues that we're expected as diplomats to be able to deal with. I too have an insect story, but an insect story has been told, so I'll hold back on mine. When I began my career, trade and economic issues were dealt with in another part of the system. You just didn't have to worry about what to do with a phytosanitary problem or a problem in the energy market. All that changed for us in the 1980s when we recognized in our government system the inseparability of political and economic issues. And we restructured at that time and renamed our Foreign Service to be a Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Then environmental issues came to the fore: oceans, fish stocks, climate change, and these days our climate change team is one of the biggest in our foreign ministry. At the same time as that diversity of issues has increased, so has within our Foreign Service the diversity of our diplomats. When I joined, I was one of literally a handful of female diplomats. There were, I think, 2 Maori diplomats. There was nobody from the other major groups of our population, Asian or Pacific peoples. These days, our diplomats look a lot more like our population at large. And that's a good thing. It brings intellectual strength because people from different backgrounds have different approaches and different solutions. Now for that question that I've been avoiding so far, for what ongoing changes and adaptations diplomats need in all our countries to help us close those dangerous gaps that I mentioned a minute ago. The basic structures of diplomacy I don't see as changing. In the future, we're still going to need rules that allow countries of all sizes, regardless of their economic or political or military strength, to have a voice. We'll still need architecture that gives those countries a place to voice their opinions, whether it's global, regional, or sub-regional. And we'll always need relationships of trust based on being on the ground, speaking the language, understanding the culture, all points that have been made by the 2 previous speakers. But within these unchanging parameters, there are shifts of emphasis, changes we need to make to adapt and update our diplomacy. My first recommendation is that we intensify our use of all available tools of modern communication to better explain the value we get from our political and economic relationships, to sell the value of the open, rules-based systems, whether political or trading. The second thought I have is that we need to be a lot more alert to social change in our own countries and the permission space that societies allow us for foreign and trade policy. The combined impacts of globalization, climate change, rapid technological change have produced uncertainty and anxiety even in our societies, to such an extent that for the first time, coming back to the World Economic Forum and the global risks, for the first time, they have identified as a global risk the fact that people are feeling a lack of control and seeing the world as an increasingly unhappy and lonely place. In these circumstances, people become suspicious of government, of authority, of change, and of foreign services. They're less likely than in the past to simply accept that the government knows best when setting foreign defence or trade policy. They need to be convinced by us. In New Zealand, our diplomats are now expected to conduct diplomacy at home as energetically as they would if they were on an overseas posting, establishing networks with civil society, advocacy, ethnic groups, professional groups of all kind. We're expected to engage actively through social media with audiences whose views that in the past we would have simply ignored. In the diplomacy of the future, again it's been alluded to, diplomats will need a great deal more technical knowledge and specialized training or self-education in such areas as climate change, cybersecurity, alternative proteins, space, artificial intelligence, and robotics. I revert one last time to the WEF Global Risks Outlook. It singled out the need to renew and improve our international political and economic systems as, quote, this generation's defining task. The global architecture we have inherited is now seen by many as too cumbersome, too bureaucratic, and too slow for the speed and complexity of our interconnected world. But the response shouldn't be to seek to discredit or abandon what we have. President Macron, addressing the Congress just over a year ago, gave a similar challenge. He called for a new breed of multilateralism, a more effective, accountable, and results-oriented multilateralism. If there's been little take-up on that, it's partly because today's global problems are seen as so complex that who knows where to start? Well, here, political leadership, as well as diplomats working together, is needed. It's not just technical knowledge and the communication skills to tell the story as to why action is needed. It's the vision. We can still learn from the leadership of the past, of President Franklin Roosevelt and Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who had the courage and the optimism to inspire others to go beyond what they thought they could do. These qualities, courage and optimism, together with patience and persistence, are as old as humankind, but they will be needed more than ever by the diplomats of the future. Thank you.
So as you might have guessed, I'm not an ambassador. I'm the son of an ambassador. But I'm glad I have a general who has my back, a sea service ally. Professor, pardon, sir? The Navy's like the Uber for the Marine Corps. That's what we're always reminded of by the Marines. Professor Alexander, Professor Wallace, distinguished ambassadors, General Gray. General Gray, for us in the military, is a legend. So it's an honor sitting next to you, sir. It's an honor being on a panel with you, sir. So I've been here before multiple times. Yona has been, and Professor Wallace have been kind enough to invite me, spoken about the Middle East and South Asia, which are my academic areas of focus. The last 3 years I've been working space, which is kind of like the Middle East. A lot of different terrain battles, turf wars in the Pentagon. If you haven't been in, there are different quarters. And so this is an interesting place for a person of Afghan heritage to see if he can influence and shape. So as I was drafting my remarks a couple days ago, I just Googled March 14th. It's a historic day on which in 1955, 8 countries signed an agreement called the Warsaw Pact. How fitting for us to have a diplomatic panel on such a unique occasion, a vestige of post-World War II world alignment that we start seeing perhaps re-emerging, right? Back then, the United States and its allies faced a single conventional enemy, as was mentioned during the Cold War, and after the Cold War, the United States led an effort to globalize into the new, international order. It's distractors, right? Mainly the Eastern Bloc, the Soviet Union, China, because we didn't want disruptors in the system. Because if you're going to be in the system, we want you to get along, and we want everybody to have an equal loss if there are disruptors. The attacks of 9/11, September 11th, 2001, marked a dramatic shift from that sort of momentum of the 1990s. A new global security posture for the international order new global governance, the diplomats in full force, sprinting at the UN, sprinting at all of our embassies, not just for protection purposes of their staff, but figuring out what the rules of the road are for them. The military being drawn into a new era. You know, we never thought about the platoon leader, the soldier, the sailor, the airman becoming your diplomats on the battlefield. But we saw that in Afghanistan, we saw that in Iraq, and we saw that in Djibouti. We see that today. And the global markets post 9/11. We remember that day when the market started crashing and all of our 401ks and retirement started dwindling. Our house prices being affected, and all at the hands of not a state actor, not the Soviet Union, but a nefarious non-state actor with a couple of people in each cell spread around the world who could affect such an outcome. And we vowed to concentrate all of our energies to mitigate any types of impact that these types of groups could have. So our posture became one of leveraging our asymmetric warfare capabilities. We will find you no matter in what cave you hide. We will get to you. And we did. All in the pursuit of causing the global insecurity in the political and economic realm to be calm again. So the 1990s push came to an end after the market crash, right? And since then, the idea of bringing Russia or China into a world order that we were the most powerful player in is not going to happen, right? Today's negotiations tell you and show you that fact. And so in the last couple of years, we've been talking about a return of the great power competition. And if you read the national security strategy that my organization promulgated in 2017, it's on the White House website, you will see the emphasis, sort of, the ship is fixing its courses, it's trying to fix its bearings, because we've been focused too much on a non-state actor, while state actors are not being given the same amount of attention. So when we think about great power competition, of course, we think about China, South China Sea, right, a maritime dispute. We think about Eastern Europe, Eurasia, and we think about Russia. And we might think about the fragmented sections that are in the Middle East and in South Asia, where these great powers are converging and along these fault lines. But nowhere else have I seen, from my experience, where great power competition is more ambiguous and nebulous than in space. There is a great power competition in space. Space figures prominently in our 2017 National Security Strategy. Our National Security Strategy says the United States considered unfettered access to and freedom to operate in space to be a vital interest. A vital interest is something for which you will fight for. Any harmful interference with or an attack upon critical components of our space architecture that directly affects this vital U.S. interest will be met with deliberate response at any time, at any place, any manner, and our domain of our choosing. Land, air, sea are the three domains. Communications, financial networks, military and intelligence systems, weather monitoring, navigation, and more have components in the space domain. The National Security Strategy calls for advancing space as a priority domain, and this will be my focus with you today. In contrast to its critics, I've seen that there is a need for United States Space Force. Not just because I'm a space junkie, but there is actually a legitimate reason. This is the right time to build that force. The current proposal that's on the Hill is the most feasible given our budgetary and other constraints. And before the Congress right now is the decision to authorize and fund the nation's space warfighters and to equip them with the necessary authorities, the legal authorities, the equipment, support, and so that they can practice and operate with freedom in operations in space to deter attacks against the terrestrial assets we have and against those that are in orbit, and safeguard our military, commercial, and civil space assets, and when necessary, to decisively defeat hostile space and counter-space threats. The United States cannot wait for another 9/11, right? A 9/11 in space, perhaps a full-on Pearl Harbor style attack on American satellite constellations to convince our US decision makers that it is now time to create a space force. Think about that for a minute. That would be akin to waiting on World War II to convince leaders to build a US Air Force. Should we ever come to conflict, the needed, which is the requirement from the DoD, the needed additional 74 Air Force squadrons or the 355 Navy ships our nation desperately needs for future contingencies would be largely irrelevant by our adversaries' space activities. America's space enterprise and our governance structure, the way we organize, was constructed on a strategic environment, the Cold War. Someone mentioned bipolar. Environment that no longer exists. Our competitive margin of dominance is shrinking due to worldwide advances in an era of multi-domain warfare. No longer are soldiers going up against soldiers, but they're using multiple domains to fight a war. And we see that every day in our battles. Space supports the terrestrial forces. Actions in space also affect our future. And no amount of wishful thinking can make our adversaries go away or their capabilities away. The first rule in strategic planning is always to be realistic. So the post-war assumptions that space would remain uncontested and that the United States and our allies would have dominance is no longer valid. It is time to invest in space by resurrecting a US Space Command and creating a military branch, the United States Space Force, which are two different things and sometimes confused, but complementary. Establishing a combatant command like Central Command, Special Operations Command, the United States Space Command, which is soon to happen, will be dedicated to space and focus on the joint warfighting operations of this vital domain, space. So when this happens, the question is, what will be the international rules? What will be the rules of engagement? What are acceptable norms and behaviors? And these are for diplomats and politicians and policymakers to figure out. US Space Command, should it come into being, will have assigned Navy, Army, Air Force, and Marine Corps personnel supporting the command with their terrestrial capabilities, but also benefiting from space to further their own service. But without a space force, we would not be able to fight a space war. A Navy sailor can fight a maritime war, but he cannot fight a space war. A soldier can be great at land warfare and use a space, but he cannot be a space warrior. I posit to you to reflect about this. The service created to think about air warfare was built after World War II instead of before. The Air Force was created in 1947 to organize, the United States Air Force was created in 1947 to organize, train, and equip for air warfare. Due to the success of the US Air Force, no ground troops have been killed by enemy aircraft attack since the end of the Korean War in 1953. How many troops were lost in World War II because we followed the same familiar land and sea and turned a blind eye to emerging air threats? To air threats, risks, and opportunities in the air. Consider that, wouldn't it have been better to have created the US Air Force in 1927? Before World War II? Before 1947? How many troops, civilians, and satellite assets will we lose in 2019 if we delay the creation of the service to think about space warfare until after the next war? History, you may not agree, I find it to be very cyclical. Conflict is inevitable. Space no longer is a sanctuary for commercial, civil, and for us in the military. We can either prepare, posture, and do it the right way, or we will be unprepared when war comes to us. And what does that mean for the diplomats, the space diplomats? The United States cannot afford to fight a World War-style war knowing that the operational battle space has exponentially expanded to include space. An opponent that controls space may hold our population centers and deployed forces at risk without ever taking a decisive terrestrial action. Imagine that. You cut off my Navy ships, satellite communications, navigational control. I'm just a vessel in the middle of the Pacific. How many Navy sailors know celestial navigation these days? They're teaching that again at the Naval Academy, sir. To keep the peace and to win the next war, we must outthink our adversaries. That means recruiting the right people to think about the right problem, which includes diplomats, and putting them in context, and the context that does not distract them from solving the problem, which is space for us. With the U.S. Space Force, space and terrestrial-focused military service members will provide the necessary forces needed by Space Command to ensure unfettered access to and the freedom to operate in space, and provide vital effects and capabilities to joint and international partners in a coalition during peacetime and during wartime. Just as the Navy stands watch to ensure that we freely navigate the world seas, America must now ensure the freedom to navigate through space. If we continue to delay the creation of a U.S. Space Force until it is too late, we will jeopardize the comforts of our American life. Today, I know exactly where this building is, but I turned on my GPS on Google just to make sure I'm not late. Imagine if I didn't have that pleasure. I've checked, and the last time they made Rand McNally's maps was 1998. Good luck finding a printed map to get to this place. Or your Uber driver getting you here, if you're a little bit more wealthy than I am. So the lifeline of our economy, the enabling asset of our national security priorities in South China Sea, Eurasia, the Middle East, and elsewhere are at stake. We must not wait until space war damages our way of life to adapt our posture. With each passing day, great power competition becomes even more the norm, and potential adversaries become more competent and capable of space. Like our land and maritime conflicts, America will never go to war without its allies. And this is especially true in space. In space, we partner, we protect, and we inform our allies. In fact, the commercial sector, you can think about satellites in space as being enemy combatants on a battlefield. They're innocent, and someone needs to protect them. Now, let me close up with this vignette for you that recently happened, the Indian satellite test. So a squadron of Air Force officers tracked a missile impacting with the Indian satellites, and were able to count all the debris that was dispersed by that explosion or by the impact, and are tracking that. And put that in perspective, in 2007, the Chinese had this similar test, and of course the debris field was much, much larger. But the way the military and our diplomats are involved in this matter is every time a Chinese debris that was exploded by the Chinese is in close proximity to a Chinese satellite, guess who calls them? It's the United States Air Force that picks up the phone and calls their counterparts in China, says, hey, you are in a very close proximity to, object blah, blah, blah. That's, they tagged it and they informed them. So the important piece here is that we have to think about space not necessarily as a warfare domain, but that even things that are non-intentional, that you don't mean to create war with, may have that impact. Now imagine if that debris hits one of our satellites. What does that mean for us? Who's responsible for that? So you need the lawyers, you need the diplomats to help broker a discussion. So let me conclude with, like any branch of the military, the stick is always in the insurance policy. The insurance fire policies never pay out, and I'm careful because I know I'm next to a lawyer, if there's no fire, but it does not mean that we don't pay for our fire insurance or that we wait until a fire to buy our insurance. Right now we have a competitive advantage, but that advantage is eroding fast, and we do need to think about space before we lose that advantage. Thank you.
I want to thank all the speakers. Before we go to the question and answer session, which is always my favorite part of one of these, I would like to ask General Al Gray, 29th Commandant of the Marine Corps, to come up and sort of draw a line under everything that we've heard today. Sir.
This won't take long because it's out of my own.
Hoorah.
Let me start by thanking all the panelists. I couldn't help but think as I was sitting here watching the audience. I wish we could have every senior class in every university in the country here with us today, because it would have been worthwhile. I'm wondering who's the first ambassador that's going to volunteer to be the ambassador in space. All right, I'll designate you as ambassador to Mars, and Ambassador Newman, you can handle Jupiter. I think it's crucial to understand and to appreciate the role of diplomacy and the role of the State Department in our whole nation and our national effort to survive as a nation and perchance flourish over time. And you need to understand, of course, I have a unique advantage over my counterparts in the other services because we have a long and continuing historical relationship with the State Department. It stems in part from the fact that Marines provide security at the 171 locations around the world and the like. And when I was on my last tour, for example, I knew Secretary Baker very well. I knew Secretary Schultz very well. And they were both Marines. We had some problems. We had the problem with the embassy in Russia, and all that kind of thing. But more importantly, in every visit that I ever made to any country, from the time I was a brigadier commanding the 4th Marine Amphibious Brigade until the time I retired as a general, I visited the embassies, and I visited the ambassadors and the deputy chiefs of mission and the operations officers and the like, and we would exchange information and ideas, and they would teach me about what the particular country needed that they were the ambassador to. I think this is very, very important. And I remember dealing, for a long time with Ambassador John Gunther Dean when he was ambassador to Cambodia, and I was in charge of planning the evacuation of Cambodia. Later, he was the ambassador to Denmark, and we used to talk all the time about how to get along in Denmark and with the people. And like, it was true with each of these countries. I noticed today we talk about great peer competition and stuff like that. The United States is, whether we like it or not, we're a global leader. And we're a global leader because it doesn't mean we're the only global leader, no, but we're a global leader. And the people of the world in every country that you'll ever visit, I don't care where you go, the real people of that country, of that nation, they really expect us to help them. And it's always been my particular experience, never make any more enemies you already have, and never do anything that hurts the people you're trying to help. And so, for example, how could you have a conference like this today and it was never mentioned the importance of Latin America? you know, it's vital. It's part of the whole globalization idea. It's part of the whole global economics, and all these countries, whether you're talking about China, Russia, you know, they want the same thing we do. They want to get ahead. They want to live free. They want to have an economic kind of capability and so on. And so I think that in all these domains of warfare and all this talk about what we're going to do, we ought to keep the whole picture in mind. For example, every country in the world needs the space capability. Every country in the world, every country that's got a kid running around one of these is dependent on space and the like. And so why don't we take that approach? I mean, it's just like, it's all these challenges. The Straits of Malacca and the South China Sea, all that's going on. The Chinese government, they need the Straits of Malacca more than anybody in the world. More oil goes through and into China than even Japan. And so, you know, there are, I guess what I'm trying to say is there are considerations about all these challenges that we have that are economic, they're diplomacy, they involve the Treasury Department, they involve all the elements of national power. And so that's sort of the simple message that I have. And with that, why don't you let them ask questions.
I guess we have a few seconds to consider the very rich insights into the intersection of diplomacy, strategy, the twins. And I would invite ambassadors or diplomats or scholars, students to make some remarks. Would you like to? Yes, please, JC.
State Department retiree like my colleagues here. I have a question about, aren't today's diplomats prisoners of the 24-hour news cycle? Well, whatever happens anywhere is suddenly known everywhere. And I think a possible case study would be Aung San Suu Kyi. Remember her? I mean, we were all very idealistic about her. She was standing up to Burmese, to the Myanmar generals in an oppressive state. How many diplomats in Rangoon at the time were writing back to their headquarters? Be careful about this lady. She's idealistic now, but when push comes to shove, she can be very hard-hearted and very tough. Or were the diplomats afraid to say things like that because of what people thought of her around the world?
I'll take a stab at that, since I spent some time next door to her when she was still a prisoner when I was in Thailand. In a sense, you're probably right in that I wouldn't say that we're prisoners to the news cycle, but my own experience was that quite often we're unduly influenced by the news cycle. And there is a certain amount of don't tell us what we don't want to hear. I would use as an example, when I was in Cambodia, another opposition person, very charismatic, who certain people back here thought the sun didn't shine on because he cast his own light. And when I reported that he had gone into the countryside and made a speech in the local language praising the Khmer Rouge, it didn't go very well back here, because they didn't want to hear that their saint had not feet of clay, but his feet were firmly planted in the stuff that you fertilize your rice paddies with. So, I would say it's not so much that our diplomats are prisoners of the news cycle, but that are those levels above them to whom they report are more influenced by the news cycle than they would care to admit. But it's even more than that, and they're influenced by their preconceptions, and so it's a matter of they only want to hear what they want to hear.
Hank, two reflections I thought of. I wouldn't call them an answer. One is, to some extent, we have always had this tension. There's a matter of degree, but it seems to me that you go back further, but when I was desk officer, even in the late 70s, from then to retirement 37 years later, if I were working in the department, first thing in the morning was press guidance, influenced by, whatever was in the news that morning, which consumed an inordinate amount of time to say usually rather little. So now the pace is faster, there's more, but that seems to me a change of degree. How much we speak about somebody, well, I mean, the news cycle also influences Congress. We're not alone. I can't think of how many times you must have testified, but you certainly noticed that an inordinate number of the questions in any testimony would be derived from what was in the news that day, rather than more fundamental reflections on the issues you were dealing with. So it seems to me that we have always had a problem of intellectually needing to get our elbows out in order to think and to speak what needed to be spoken. And it may be worse, it may be faster, I don't know. But I would submit that it's a problem of degree and not of a new, intellectually, something new.
Any of the other ambassadors, speakers?
You got one?
Okay.
I have a question for Dr. Sadat. In the concept of Space Force, what consideration have you given to the role of artificial intelligence and autonomous weapons? More deep learning, very deep, maybe outside of human control. What attention do you give to artificial intelligence?
So since Space Force is not yet operational and legislation hasn't authorized and funded it yet, I can speak to, for example, what Navy is doing, because the current services. So artificial intelligence is one of the key pinnacles that the current Chief of Naval Operations is driving forward. I could tell you that think about a gray object in the middle of the ocean coming up with a telescope, and you using artificial intelligence to be able to find that at a very high pace, right? A submarine coming up, and you being able to find that across a huge area in somewhere between South Asia all the way down to New Zealand, but very, very fast. So artificial intelligence for this deep scanning of the ocean surface is very important for the environmental aspects, prediction of hurricanes. So it's being used very aggressively in the government and the military to help with early warning, early detection. But with weaponization, not so much at the moment, because still need to get some clarity on it. But it will be in the future. I mean, you have to think about 30, 40 years from now. I mean, who would have thought that little phone this little phone, I mean, when I was born in 1975, I thought beta was like awesome, right? Going in there and clinking it down, and then it's breaking and finding a way to fix. Now my 3-year-old knows how to turn this on. She locked it up for like a million years. I had to go and find a way to reset it. But if she's not locking it up, she can get to YouTube. She can do everything. She can send pictures all over the place. She's 3 years old. So think about 30 years from now. We potentially might be going to these planets to find the next sand that will be better than silicon, that will be better than copper, that will make this phone look like the beta cassette of the 1980s. That, this is going to be obsolete for our children's era. Think about that. Think about the run to get copper by Chinese, and think about the next mineral that's going to make copper look like coal. And we will have to be going to these planets and potentially to be extracting things, right? This is very forward-leaning, abstract thinking. This is nothing out there yet. But we will need a supply line. We will need a sea lane to go to. There's going to be other countries. We're going to have basically Marines in space to help us to make sure nobody gets in each other's way, nobody's stealing, no piracy. I mean, if you take this further out, this is where we're going to be.
It's just the opposite of diplomacy, a weapon for making decisions for themselves. Talk about autonomous drones right now, and they detect things and decide for themselves. That's the opposite of diplomacy. What role do you see for that, and how far should that go?
I don't necessarily have an opinion on that at the moment. That's not my area. But I mean, right now with most drones, they don't fire on their own. There's an operator that pushes the button.
Let me take a shot at that. In this whole multi-domain discussion about control and OPCON and making decisions, there has to be an overriding intent in each domain and in each command. And it needs to be clearly understood. It comes down from the president, the ambassadors, and so on, but there is an intent. And that intent has to be clearly understood 2 echelons up and 2 echelons down, because what's going to happen, you're going to lose communications. You're going to lose some of the capability you think you have. It's a piece of cake to knock down communications today, whether you use cyber or other techniques and so on. So people are going to have to act in a decentralized mode. Lower people are going to have to make key decisions within the overall intent, and so on. So it's a whole different thought process. It's very well articulated in the maneuver warfare thought process and in Marine doctrine, really. But that's the way they're going to have to look at this, and it's going to require a thinking person's whole structure. Young men and women and so on are going to have to be able to think for themselves and do things. We're going to have to learn to conduct operations in radio silence and in mission control silence like we used to in the old days. We're going to have to go back to learn how to read a map and in some cases make maps. So this is the way it's going to be, and it'll be interesting, but hopefully we'll be able to handle it.
Okay, we have Mike here and then in the back, okay?
Thanks very much. First of all, I have a comment on Ron's comments and a question. Ron, you're right about the press guides. Having been stuck on that shore during the early days of the State Department, becoming more citizen, having been a foreign correspondent in an earlier career, you're right. I don't think the basics have changed that much. The pace may have. But I always struck how often the pressures of getting press guidance out forced the formulation of policy almost on the fly. More so perhaps in some bureaus than others. I was in the counterterrorism bureau. Sometimes we are forced to come up with a position within an hour or so in order to meet the new deadline for press guidance. But my basic question is broader. And I'd like to hear from Ambassador Banks and the American ambassadors. I was in Australia, New Zealand in February and talked to some of your former colleagues and people at Victoria University, spoke and elsewhere, and also in Australia. there's a lot of dismay about what's going on in Washington policy. And I'd like to get your perspective on how do diplomats deal with administration that is no longer so interested in multilateral, even bilateral efforts, and is rather capricious, it may seem, or unpredictable. And how do you deal with that, especially with situations such as evolving with China, North Korea, and now Iran? What kind of challenges do you see both in reporting back and also explaining it to the other governments?
I guess we're working on Chatham House rules, are we? Look.
I don't mean to put you on the spot.
Well, I spoke in my address about the importance of having a predictable rules-based international order. And that's one point that we do keep making to our friends in the US.
I don't think you
Sorry.
are on Chatham House.
Okay, that's all right. Don't worry. I'm not going to say anything that's... That's fine. That's fine. What I was going to say is we do use opportunities when we are in contact with your political leaders to make that point, to remind that for smaller countries like New Zealand, it really is important to have the US engaged, as you always have been, in the multilateral system. And I'm not going to speak for any other countries, but that's certainly an important issue for us. As far as how we engage, how we sort of describe what's happening here, the US for us is always a really important and very highly valued partner. We're Five Eyes partners. Our task, and the task that I was given by my foreign minister, is to have the best possible understanding of what's happening here, to reflect that back in the clearest way, and to achieve the best possible relationship of trust. Now, we fully understand that your administrations, as they come and go, will have somewhat different views on foreign policy or the place in the world. That's for you to decide. Our task as diplomats is to understand it and make sure that we reflect it honestly, which I think, to the best of our ability, we do.
Can I say something? I just want to add a point and ask a question. Well, this mic does not pick us up. You see, it's just...
Yeah, they can.
No, this is just picking up.
Okay.
It doesn't amplify, so I'll try to speak loudly. I had a friend years ago who was a very distinguished, accomplished ambassador from a Latin American country, a prominent fellow, and he said at that time that he felt he had two jobs as an ambassador here. One was the traditional task of reporting to his own country, but he said, and he felt, that his second task was to report to us. In other words, he felt that his job was in a quiet, hopefully effective way, not just playing the hill, to sort of inform the United States of what his country thought. And I don't know whether that was realistic. He felt he was doing that, and I'm just curious to know what your reaction might be, Ambassador Banks, and what others might think.
I can easily answer that. In fact, we had our Foreign Minister and Deputy Prime Minister here last December, and he gave a very clear message, both publicly and in private, when he saw Vice President Pence, Ambassador Bolton, Secretary Pompeo, of the importance that we see of the United States' role in the Pacific. And our urge was to be prepared to work ever more closely with other traditional donors and partners in the South Pacific, the Pacific Islands region, which is closest to us and our most important neighborhood. So we do reflect the world as we see it from where we sit, further away than anybody except Antarctica. And we look up, and it looks different looking up towards China than it does looking down from Washington. And just this very morning, I accompanied the head of our Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, who's also the equivalent of our National Security Advisor, in to see Ambassador Bolton. And again, this was another opportunity for us, for my colleague, to say, what are the things that we value about the US and our region? What do we think is helpful for you to know about the way we see our region? So yes, it is definitely a two-way process, and we use that two-way channel very actively.
We have two questions, one here, one there. Over there. Can you identify yourself, please?
Yes, thank you. My name is Tom Caulfield. And first of all, I want to thank everybody for taking out of your schedules to come talk with us. I'm going to change the subject really quick. I'm going to get down to a practical level, and I want to talk about anti-corruption and the mission within embassies. And I ask that because I too am retired from government, 38 years. And my whole world has been anti-corruption. Now I travel for UN, ODC, also drugs and crimes, helping other countries as it relates to looking at their internal anti-corruption efforts. I recently came back from Tanzania, I've been in Indonesia and other countries. Never have I gone to the U.S. Embassy and talked to anybody about what the U.S. embassies are doing in anti-corruption. Not because I didn't believe you were, because I don't know. I recently in Tanzania went to the U.S. Embassy just to explore that. And I found out that at least the embassy in Tanzania has little to no activity associated with anti-corruption other than the Department of Justice who sends out that person to do training. So my question is anti-corruption outside the scope of U.S. embassies in countries, or am I missing the boat on that? For the last 3 years, I haven't really been involved with embassies, and I don't want to miss that opportunity.
No, I would say anti-corruption is a central part of our policies, especially in Latin America, where I was. In fact, I would tie it to our commercial diplomacy too, in that since the U.S. passed the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which makes it a crime for an American company to pay a bribe overseas, it would be a crime in the United States as well. We preach that to every host government, saying, if you hire an American company, you should have the satisfaction of knowing there will be no corruption in this process because it would be a crime in the United States. And we watch it closely. And we have been working in the OECD, for example, to level the playing field because other countries can take it off their taxes, paying a bribe as a local price for doing business. I'm talking about countries like France and Japan and some others. So yeah, anti-corruption is very important. We had anti-corruption programs in every place where I've been. We support NGOs that fight corruption in many places. We urge transparency in the handling of money. The Millennium Challenge account has been formed to guard against these corrupt practices and identifies countries that have best practices on corruption where we can feel that our aid is secure, because for many years, a lot of our aid was being siphoned off to powerful families and other places. And now you would be amazed how many controls there are in place to ensure that our dollar goes where it's supposed to go.
Is there a possibility that mission focus has shifted? Because again, I haven't really, all my contacts, I really have never really heard anything about U.S. embassies involved other than Department of Justice helping deploy laws. Other than that.
Well, I retired 10 years ago, so I couldn't tell you.
I think probably, I mean, it sort of depends on how you ask the question and who you ask it of. As Ambassador Gutierrez said, everything that we do is informed by our laws against corruption and corrupt practices, but they're not labeled. I mean, when we're helping a company negotiate a contract, I mean, we don't have a sign saying this is an anti-corruption move, but everything that we do leads down that path. And I guess to put it in perspective, I had dinner this weekend with an Indian colleague of mine. He and I served as ambassadors together in a country I won't name, because I want to go back there on vacation someday. But we were talking about our aid programs and how different they were. We provided aid. Our USAID people had people on the ground making sure that the aid went to the organization it was designed for. We did not hand over commodities or money directly to government officials. And the country never asked because they knew the answer would be not no, but hell no. And my Indian colleague says, oh yeah, we had a program like that, and the prime minister insisted on a certain percentage of all of the rice we shipped in had to be put in his warehouses before the rest went out. So it's not that we don't have the programs. I mean, there's no office in the embassy, there's no anti-corruption officer. Every person in the mission who deals with the local government does it from the perspective of, these are the rules that we do this by, and it's either do it this way or forget it. So, I mean, but if you went into the embassy and said, who's the anti-corruption officer here, or who's running the anti-corruption programs, you'll get a blank stare, because there are no anti-corruption programs. The anti-corruption is part of all of the programs.
Let me say something, because I think the United States does a great deal more than that even suggests. I actually drafted the procurement regulations of AID many, many years ago, and it was very interesting. Some years ago, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which is part of the government, made a fairly unprecedented grant to Indonesia of $50 million to improve their procurement systems, and clearly the principal purpose, well, one purpose is to avoid incompetence, which is often a greater problem than even corruption. And the second was clearly it was that. And I have friends in the department who I speak to from time to time, and they're seized of this. Now, it isn't always polite to look a president in the face and say you're corrupt, but so sometimes it's done. But no, we're tremendously concerned with that, way beyond the Justice Department Foreign Corrupt Practice Act.
I travel and do public procurement. That's what I do.
I'm sorry?
That's what I do, is anti-corruption as related to public procurement.
Yeah, well, the other thing is, I've spoken to ambassadors who are very, maybe even overly conscious of the visas which they grant. And they're very conscious in some countries of not giving visas to people because they think they are going to pursue their own kind of personal corrupt aims. So I think it's it's really pervasive throughout the system, consciousness of this issue. Now, 50 years ago, 40 years ago, it was considered bad form to use the word corruption. You thought you were insulting people. Today, the people in the countries you're talking about, they're the victims principally of it, and they're very conscious of it, and I think we respond to it.
But could I just have one thing? I think, first of all, there is no U.S. national policy of dealing with corruption. There are a lot of individual policies geared to procurement, to our own businesses. There is no U.S. overarching policy. It is not clear that there is any call for a U.S. overarching policy. It is not at all clear that we have any great reformist mission in the world on corruption that goes beyond the individual interests motivating those policies. It's a debatable point, but I would not grant automatically that we have such an interest. Secondly, there's a variation in importance of the country and therefore of corruption, so that where we have huge amounts of economic aid or political interest, we end up with more interest in the corruption issue, either because our money is wasted or because our political aims can't be achieved if the corruption of the government is in the way. In a country where we have minimal interest and lots of problems, it's not clear that we need to be mounting our horse and tilting at windmills on the subject of corruption. And then I would just add one personal observation, which is that I think our approach to corruption is often badly skewed, because corruption, if it is at a level where you know the price and you get what you pay for it, is economically no different from any other tax. It is economically perfectly manageable in your business, and it works that way in a large parts of the world. When corruption is rampant, rapacious, you don't know what you get, you don't know if you get your results, it's a huge impediment to business and to life. Our approach is almost wholly juridical and moralistic, despite the fact that a very, very large part of the world does not, in fact, share such an approach. So there is an interesting philosophical question of how we got so sure that we're right. But in many places, frankly, in my experience, if we were focused on
keeping corruption in bounds as a matter of efficiency rather than as a matter of morality and juridical handling, we would be in much better shape. That's not the approach we're going to take. And there are a lot of U.S. internal reasons for having anti-corruption approaches in our procurement, the use of our aid and our business. That's our business. Whether we have a comparable interest in reforming the economic practices of other countries is perhaps less clear to me.
Okay, we have time for 1 year, and then
Just check things up a little bit.
I would like to express my appreciation for this invitation. It's very, very important to me. I would like to make a remark and then raise a question. In terms of remark, I would like to highlight the fact that in our countries, our diplomacy is more concentrated on economic investment, on trade, than on all these issues that have been raised there. Because we need to develop our countries. I'm ambassador here, not only with the US government, but also with IMF and World Bank. This said, I'd like to go back to the case of Libya. I would like to figure out what were the role of diplomats in going to war and regarding the aftermath of war, bearing in mind the fact that Gaddafi had a very close relation with the terrorist group and had a huge amount of arms under his control. Thank you.
I'm not sure you have the right panel here to answer. I mean, I can speculate, so can the rest of us, but I don't think you really have the right group here to give you an authoritative answer to your question. You did have a largely White House-driven policy, and it's not clear to me that we had a diplomatic lead. We now have an effort of diplomats to support a UN lead in constructing a government. I'm not sure that that policy is wholly working. We have an interesting problem, and I won't give you an answer, but because I don't have one. We have several of our major allies funding a contrary policy in Libya. So you have Egypt, United Arab Emirates, among others, funding General Haftar in his effort to take over the country. You have a UN effort, which a good part of Western Europe and the United States supports, but it's not a very muscular support. It just raises the question of whether diplomacy is meaningful when it is in certain situations where you have both diplomacy and force. Can you have meaningful diplomacy if you divorce it from force? So I only answer a question with a question. I don't have an answer.
We can certainly discuss it with another forum, and we'll invite you to speak and some of the others, because the bottom line is not only the role of diplomats, depends how you define it, but also those who are experts who are sent to assist many other countries, like the role of the United Nations, the technical assistance, and to make sure that the international community is involved not only in terms of charity, but also to assist or teach a generation of farmers and fishermen, as the famous proverb from Asia indicated, that if you give a man a fish, he will eat for a day. If you teach the man how to fish, he will eat for the rest of his life. So It's the question of the role of multiple organizations, multiple people who can contribute to advance the cause of peace, with justice, and prosperity. But we cannot cover, obviously, all these issues today. We have one more question we have to close because we have to end this session. You have the question there?
Good afternoon. My name is Gary Petrie. Thank you so much for having us. My question is about information. When I went to service school, we learned the DIME, D-I-M-E, diplomatic, and then we kind of skipped over I, and then we went to military and economic. Today, Ambassador Ray, your earlier comments about an increasingly digital world, I think even more a facet of our everyday lives. We have lots of history in terms of other domains. 80 years or so history in the DoD world that I come from, sea, air, and land, but we don't have the same sort of cultural appreciation for cyber and space. The digital age isn't coming in a few years. It's been here for a couple decades. And in the DoD and IC intel community, I see sort of a lack of a standard set of skills that sort of approach cyber and space. And I'm relatively new to the State Department, but I see a similar trend. And Madam Ambassador, to your point, the need for rules is important. There seems to be an absence of rules as it applies to the I, the information, the I. The need for skills for diplomats to do their assistance, their statecraft, and their advocacy missions is wholly dependent upon information. But if we have people come in and say we want to get rid of embassies because we want to go all to email, I agree that was a foolish endeavor to consider. But it's important to consider how information plays a part in diplomacy writ large. So I'd just like to ask just anybody in the panel, do you guys see sort of an existential issue in terms of diplomacy not being well served if we can't get a handle on the I, the information piece, in terms of our elements of national defense?
Most certainly. And going back to the question that was asked of our New Zealand colleague, or of all of us actually, of the role of the ambassador or the role of the diplomat. And I would submit that the role of diplomats from the very first diplomat has always been two-way communication. You represent your sovereign to the sovereign that you are sent to. You're basically a conduit explaining in both directions so that you build understanding between the two entities, the one you represent and the one that you're sent to. Part of the problem in getting a handle on the information is, from my perspective, not an official view, and I came out of the military too, and in 1982 when I came out of the military, in 1982, we were not quite digital, but we were getting a handle on electronics. And I joined the State Department. We didn't even have fax machines in most of our posts. In fact, I don't think we had fax machines in any of our posts. I had been using thermofaxes in the Army since the early 70s, and the State Department didn't have faxes. The computers.
We had electric quill sharpeners.
They had number 2 pencils and erasers. Then they got the Wang computer. Are you old enough to remember the Wang? I mean, we were using Wangs long after the DoD had gone to PCs. In fact, I think they got rid of the last Wang computers probably in the 1990s. So I guess what I'm saying is part of it's cultural, in that the Department of State, the oldest cabinet department in the U.S. government, by the way, the first one organized by the Continental Congress, has always been behind the Department of Defense in terms of adoption of technology. Part of it has to do with the fact that we're not budgeted to be able to be as generous as the Department of Defense is. But part of it too, my observation, is that we're still wedded to sort of a 19th century clipper ship and quill pen culture of you do it today the way you did it yesterday because that's more comfortable. I remember when I first bought a fax machine and installed, I was number 2 in the consulate in Chiang Mai, Thailand, and I bought a fax machine and installed it, and I thought the embassy and our bureau back here in Washington were going to have puppies over it because you can't send official documents over a fax machine. You stick them in the mail, you put them in an envelope, and you hand them to an uncleared civilian postman. Why can't you? And it took the lawyers, seriously, it took the State Department lawyers 6 months to decide that a fax machine could be used to transmit unclassified official documents. That's part of the problem. And I don't know that there's a ready solution. I mean, I've been inside the State Department other than to the auditorium since I retired in 2012, but I would hazard a guess that offices in the State Department right now are still probably a decade behind offices in the Defense Department in their use of information technology and equipment that allows people to process information. And until politically we get a change in the view that we have of funding the State Department, and the State Department adopts a culture of not taking on new jobs unless it does like the Defense Department and ask for new people to do those new jobs, that's not going to change.
Thank you very much.
Do you think, though, do you think that Harry makes a great point here, though? Certainly information operations, information warfare, if you want to call it that, that's here. And it's here big time.
Oh, yeah.
And in the Defense Department, for example, each service has a lieutenant, has a 3-star person running that for them. And so it seems to me that the State Department and everybody else in government ought to get up to speed a little bit and get on with it.
There is some of that. You have this new counterterrorism center. There is an inherent tension, and I'm not sure if you'll ever solve it, between the need for speed in information warfare and the need for control over what you say. And I have not noticed that the military has been more flexible or adroit than state in taking off command in order to allow speed of control.
We're a little bit better than you think.
Yeah, might be. I can only judge from the examples I've seen in which both are miserable, so there's nothing to choose between.
But I didn't mean for my comments to be an indictment on the state.
But no, much of it, the indictment is perfectly justified.
I have a question for the panel. So this brings an interesting topic. I mean, so Harry mentioned cyber and information. So the diplomats of today should be able to assess the country that they're in, their capabilities. For example, should they go to war with that neighbor, perhaps in recent weeks we saw a case of this, and say, hey, I'm going to conduct a cyber attack on country X. And the diplomat should be able to foresee the ramifications and say, hey, we don't advise you in doing that because potentially it might have a kinetic repercussion against you. But these diplomats need to be really on, like you said, on the cutting edge and be able to see this. And it's a hard thing to do because, if you're a political scientist, how are you going to become a techie, right? I mean, that's a dilemma.
Yeah, bullets obey Newtonian physics. Cyber is different. Cyber has different rules.
Well, I think we all have to come to terms with the fact that domain, the cyber domain, is probably, well, it is now, but definitely in the future is going to become the key place that we need to be aware and have some element of control and maneuverability. But it's getting the people who have the power to make the decisions to think in that way. I mean, you have to have budgets, you have to have authority to be able to do these things, and as long as the people who are writing the rules and writing the laws are still thinking in the old ways, you just, you're
Let me
you're stuck.
interrupt. General Gray, do you want to say something, or have you spoken your piece
No,
already?
I would just say, technically, we can probably do it tonight. But the authorities and stuff like that, people act like you have 8 or 9 months to make a decision. And in terms of cyber, you got 8 or 9 seconds. And so we got to kind of speed up our thinking.
I think I want to thank everyone, but I'll say 2 things. We can have programs in the future. Our colleague from Guinea has suggested a subject, and I think this discussion seems we might be ready for a program as well. And so we'll get Yona to work on it. Listen, I want to thank everyone, and I hope you'll come back. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.